All right, everyone. Welcome to the Archaeology of Bear Ceremonialism in Minnesota. Tonight's lecture will be presented by David Mather. He is a National Register Archaeologist for Minnesota's State Historic Preservation Office. He's a specialist in zooarchaeology and environmental archaeology and former consultant archaeologist for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe's Tribal Historic Preservation Office. Bear ceremonialism was the subject of Mather's doctoral dissertation at the University of Minnesota. At this point, I am going to turn the presentation over to David.
Thank you so much. And I will share my screen. Dun, dun, dun. There we go. And I'm going to use my cursor as a pointer, and so I think that should show up. I hope it does. It is really, really nice to be here, and I'm so excited about all the lectures this month. I was just mentioning that I was very disappointed that I couldn't see the one on Grand Meadow, and then last week I was apparently entering my absent-minded period of life and registered for the event the morning after it happened, and so I totally missed that. So I'm really glad to hear about the recordings because I will watch them. This presentation is about my dissertation research, something I've worked on and off for decades, and it's been really nice actually to be working on it again, getting an article together for the upcoming issue of the Minnesota Archaeologist on the Prairie site, which is one of the sites I'll be talking about tonight. So I'll go through a number of things, start with some kind of key concepts, a little bit of time depth stuff, talk about, what is bear ceremonialism, and then get into Minnesota. There's three primary bear sites in Minnesota that I'll talk about as case studies, but also give a lot of context about ecological regions and other bear finds. And then I'll get down to some, tooth measurement data that was really helpful in studying the three sites in terms of interpreting them. And then I'm going to try to just kind of keep myself moving quickly, and so that we have time for questions at the end. As I mentioned, this was my dissertation research, and I was trying to approach two different primary goals with that. One is to create a historic context of bear ceremonialism through archaeology for indigenous archaeology and heritage management in Minnesota, and that indigenous archaeology is an approach to archaeology that recognizes that professional archaeologists are not the only stakeholders. Tribal communities and governments especially have great interest in management of archaeological sites. One thing about bear ceremonialism that was really interesting and also challenging for me was that it kind of muddied up the overly neat categories that archaeologists and heritage managers often use about, burial sites on one hand versus habitation sites, so-called, on the other hand. And it really opened my eyes to the complexity of how sacred sites can be represented in the archaeological record. The other primary audience for this was bear biologists, because once I was getting into the subject, I was talking with some of them for context, and they were very interested in the historical and archaeological applications because they as well felt like they did not have any time depth to their studies of bear biology, which they use for establishing hunting regulations. So when I started this, like in the late 1990s, a long time ago now, American black bears were really kind of exploding across the state. The population was up to about 25,000 to 30,000. We're at approximately 15,000 now. They were expanding in terms of numbers and geographic range. And so this was a big issue for the game managers, because, what is the so-called natural bear population? What was their historic range? And that's different. It's useful to know, but it's also different than what the decision might be about where they are now. And so American black bears are the current bear species and historically a primary bear species in Minnesota. They are not the only one. We also, I'm quite certain, had grizzly bears living in Minnesota. Certainly a couple thousand years ago, probably more recently. They are extirpated from this range, this part of their range. The closest grizzly bear population now is in Yellowstone National Park. And of course, so in terms of key concepts, extirpated is a very different thing from extinct, like the poor Carolina parakeet. There are historical records from Jonathan Carver of what seemed to be Carolina parakeets in the Minnesota River, which is really, really fascinating. But they and passenger pigeons and some other native species are extinct. More key concepts. I'm approaching this from a background in environmental archaeology. I'm a zooarchaeologist, and so I study the archaeology of animal bones, both in terms of food and sometimes ritual, but also environment. Other approaches to environmental archaeology include archaeobotany. This is on the lower left, a wild rice grain seen through low power magnification. You can see it's a part of a grain and it's charred. Dendrochronology, tree rings is part of this. Insect remains tell a lot about past environments, and as does pollen. So this Mickey Mouse ear thing here is a pine tree pollen grain, and so paleoecologists can reconstruct vegetational sequences through time from peat and muck at the bottom of lakes and from wetlands by taking pollen cores and studying the samples. And of course that in certain cases can tell us a lot about human history as well. So with zooarchaeology, not all of the bear sites that I will be talking about are based on zooarchaeology, or bear finds rather, but most of them are. And so I was, for the most part, looking at curated collections of animal bone that already had identified bears in them. There's going to be a lot more sites represented in curated collections than I have been able to address, because most curated collections do not have identified animal bone collections in them. The important thing for zooarchaeology is these abbreviations. NISP is the number of identified specimens, and so what that is just counting each fragment. Like what can you say about it? If you can identify it to species, you tally up those numbers. Then for the ones that you can identify to species, like for example, black bears, you will figure out the minimum number of individuals, the MNI, and you do that by figuring out what body parts are represented. And so if you have, I'm just making up numbers, if you have 2 left mandibles, and here's a little part of a mandible, then you would have a minimum of 2 black bears. And so neither of these numbers is going to be the actual number of those animals that was represented in all probability, but it gives you a range of consideration. And these images are from the Crace site, which I'll be talking about as well. These are black bear archaeological bone fragments. And a last concept that informs the approach that I've taken to this is archaeobiology, and I really kind of love this concept, the relationships between humans and plants and animals and their effects upon each other, both in the distant past and currently. And so I'm going to breeze through archaeological time here, and I'm going to go quickly because you know this, but I think it's helpful to keep in mind in terms of the context. And so the archaeological history of Minnesota begins approximately 13,000 years ago. This is at the end of the last glacial period. And not until about 10,000 years ago does the climate shift to the start of the Holocene, which is the current climatic period that we're in, and the last of the glacial ice is melting away, but there's open ground before then. So this is the beginning of the Paleo-Indian period, and right here pretty much at the contact with between the Paleo-Indian and Archaic traditions is the oldest bear site that we have in Minnesota, about 8,000 years ago, and I'll touch on that later on. There's a few other ones known in the Archaic, including one grizzly bear find from the Mississippi headwaters area, which I'll show an image of later. But most of them are from the woodland tradition, which starts about 3,000 years ago. This is, of course, the period when burial mounds were first built in Minnesota, where all the different styles of pottery are from this time period. Also during this time period, the shift to bow and arrow technology, domesticated plants, and a great increase in the use of wild rice, and probably development of technology for parching and storage of wild rice, and populations increased. And this time period is generally when archaeologists feel pretty comfortable starting to identify historically known American Indian tribes in the archaeological record. Of course, their ancestry goes much farther back. All this history is American Indian history, but we're really getting back there. Beginning in the late 17th century, the fur trade begins, and it's much shorter period. But this is first the French, and then the British, and then later American fur trade. And of course, there's archaeological examples of fur posts, and we see trade goods on archaeological sites. And then the very last period, this little skinny yellow bar, is our current statehood, or Minnesota Territory and statehood period. So the territory was established in 1849, statehood in 1858. As a completely normal human being, if I think about 1858 or 1849, that is a really long time ago for me. And when I think about it as an archaeologist and a historian, it's really pretty recent, but it's tiny compared to the rest of this. That's something that I think is really important for us all to remember. Basically, almost all of historic preservation, every building in the Chippewa inventory, every building or structure listed in the National Register of Historic Places in Minnesota is in this little thing here. And we've got all of the rest of this period that's represented only by archaeology, by cultural landscapes, by traditional cultural properties. All of those things are very underrepresented in our historical designations. I really hope through the course of my career to be able to shift that balance a lot. We're not going to be able to make it completely the same, because it's a lot easier to find buildings, you've probably noticed. But anyway, we hope to have better equity and representation as we move forward. So bear ceremonialism. This is an anthropological concept, and it comes from an article published in 1926 by A. Irving Hollowell. He was a cultural anthropologist, and this was his dissertation. He was really interested in the ways, the similarity in ways that reverence or veneration for bears was depicted in the anthropological literature, and just like explorers' accounts and other written accounts of that time. And so he did this kind of really broad library survey where he looked at it from Eastern North America, and he was focused on the northern world, the northern hemisphere. So Eastern North America, all the way across northern North America, Siberia, and and Scandinavia. He ended with the Sami, with what we called the Lapps in like Sweden and Finland and Norway. And so, and he looked at all this, and he described all these different traditions and how similar they were, like uncannily similar. And he concluded that the source of all of this was must have been some ancient kind of common root that by implication was older than movements of people around the world, older than language differences. And those are really kind of potent ideas for archaeology. They're really, really big, broad concepts that are really difficult to get to, but very interesting, thought-provoking. And so some of these traditions that he talked about, the name for a bear, or a bear would be called something other than a bear. And so the idea was that if you used the actual word, that it would be offensive to the bear, or it would scare it away. And so respectful names like kinship terms, grandmother, grandfather, or just more descriptive things like honey paws or old man in the woods or things like that. And so people would talk, if someone knew where a bear was hibernating, they'd describe it that way. There would be rituals conducted before the hunt. The bear has very potent spiritual power, and so a lot of times there would be taboos based on age or gender about who was involved in different activities, or what might be, or what parts of the feast were okay for different people to participate in. The people would apologize to the bear. This was like a relationship of reciprocity, where the bear would be giving itself, and the people were showing gratitude, and they would give it offerings, keep the bones from being messed up, or not let dogs chew on them, things like that. And then they would put at least some of them, the skull and maybe other parts, in a special place afterwards, where they would be safe from harm as well. And so in some cases, other animals were treated with some aspects of these traditions, but they were most deeply expressed in terms of bears. And that's all a fascinating thing to continue, or to consider. In Minnesota, an example of this is from this wonderful book by Maud Keg, who was an elder at the Mille Lacs band of Ojibwe. And she just, in this book, she was telling stories from her childhood. And so when you look at the book, on one side of the pages is her speaking in Ojibwe, and then there's the English translation, and it's a lovely thing to see. She told lots and lots of really interesting stories about all sorts of things. The one that, of course, I zeroed in on right away was called The Bear's Funeral. And she was talking about, she was a very little girl at this time, and she was with her grandmother, and they went to a place where there was a wigwam, and it was I think in the winter, yeah, because she harnessed the horses for the sleigh, and so anyway, they went in there, and she did not know what was going on. There was an old man, she said, who was like telling people where to sit, and she realized it was a funeral, the way people were acting and what was going on. But then she looked up to to one side, and there was a bear's head there. That was the focus of the whole activity. And the bear, she said, was just huge and was all decorated with ribbons. There were a lot of dishes around in there. Anyway, it was a ceremony, the funeral for the bear. And that would have been probably, sometime in the early 20th century. So Hollowell talked a lot about, he had a lot of information about Algonquian speaking groups, including to some degree the Ojibwe. He had essentially no information about the Dakota. And so that was kind of a hole in his work. In the 1930s, Ruth Landis, who was a cultural anthropologist as well, worked for her dissertation at Manitou Rapids in Ontario, which is on the Rainy River, just across from the northern border from Minnesota. Later on, she was at Red Lake and Cass Lake. And then in 1935 was with the Dakota at Prairie Island and Red Wing. And she wrote about all of these things. Her experiences there at Prairie Island really added a lot of, I think, really useful context for considering bear ceremonialism amongst the Dakota, because a lot of the archaeological record and all three of the principal bear sites in Minnesota are Dakota affiliated sites. And so 1935, she was with Moses Wells and Grace Rouillard. And she, amongst the things they told her they told her of a shaman named John Smith who was hunting, in the 19th century, and he received, direction for hunting from dreams. There was, they located a hibernating bear in the winter, and then how all that went. There was an eat all feast, and so the bear feast, and significantly the bear head was cooked, shared by the hunter and other people. The bones were gathered and buried by a tree, out of respect for the bear's spirit. And then another function altogether, the bear's skull was used for divination, for hunting. And so the shaman laid medicine on the bear skull and prayed for a certain number of deer. And so there's different ritual things going on related to bears. And this is what she's describing amongst all these other things about daily life and culture that she's describing. And so there's not a lot of detail, but this was really informative. Up on the Rainy River, Maggie Wilson, who was an elder there at Manitou Rapids, worked with Ruth Landis for many years, and wrote stories for her that were kind of the basis for the Ojibwe woman. And so she described other sorts of rituals with bears. There was the bear sweat lodge, which was a terrible ordeal, 80 stones, which sounds really intense. Participants must stay inside, and they assumed the fierce aspects of bears, and the lodge itself came to resemble the cavernous insides of a great bear. And it sounds terrifying and difficult. Bear visionaries, and Maggie Wilson was a bear visionary. She said that a curer told her that she had a tiny bear in the base of her neck, and so she was supposed to not eat bear meat because the little bear did not like that, but she was a bear visionary. So the point of this is lots of different things going on related to bears. And so Hallowell focused on the bear hunt, the feast, the funeral. He didn't use the word funeral, but those activities, and the bear grave. Landis and other researchers have talked about all these other aspects of bear power, and all of these things together have been, in current practice, are referred to as bear ceremonialism. And I think it's useful to consider or be aware of all these when we're looking at archaeological sites. So like for bear power, bear healers, for example, bear warriors like berserkers, bear societies might have secret rituals that only their members know, where other members of their community might not. And these things all have implications for archaeology. The first archaeological applications of Hallowell's idea that I'm aware of are from William Ritchie in Western New York. So mid 20th century, there was 2 sites he worked at where he found where there was unusual concentrations of bear remains, and he just connected that with the idea of bear ceremonialism, which is probably not wrong, but it was a kind of a quick one-to-one thing. Here's another example from Sweden of a bear grave from a Sami site, and you can see and so this is a brown bear, same as the grizzly here. You can see the skull over here, and then the body has been butchered and eaten in the feast, but all the pieces are kind of put back to where they should be. Like here's the shoulder blades, and the paws are underneath where they're supposed to be. And so the general pattern, archaeological pattern, is that bears are almost invisible. You don't find them with other food waste. They're greatly underrepresented because they're put in these different places, but then every once in a while, there's this rare, spectacular find. In Minnesota, the native nations here are the Dakota and the Ojibwe, and then other Siouan and Algonquian speakers. There's sites that have black bear and grizzly bear remains, mostly black bears. I'll talk about some of these different examples, concentrations of skulls, pit features, cremated bear paws, prepared skulls. So mostly zooarchaeology, but also rock art, and then effigy mounds in southeastern Minnesota. Of course, Effigy Mounds National Monument is in northeast Iowa. And then a few cases of portable art like this little stone bear. I want to mention briefly the bear site at Mille Lacs. And so I was involved in the excavation there in 1998. This is for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe. And this is a Dakota, a late woodland Dakota site. And it's considered a sacred place by both groups. It is not considered a place that is appropriate for public visitation or interpretation. And so I'm being very careful to not talk about the location in any precise way. And I feel, to be honest, I feel a little uncomfortable talking about it at all because it's not mine to talk about. I'm mentioning it because this is what kind of set me off on this path decades ago. And so it's just, on one hand, it's kind of difficult for me to talk about the rest of it without reference to this. I also think it's useful just to say a little bit about it because it was spectacular. These yellow ovals are bear skulls that were very poorly preserved, but intact, just under the ground surface in this big pit feature, and there were post molds so on each side, so probably some sort of structure over it, at least, or a minimum number of 68 bear skulls. And this is just part of the top uncovered. And when we went down like 5 centimeters more here, there were lots and lots more showing up. So very easy to imagine hundreds of bear skulls in this feature. And how did it was astounding. It is not an exaggeration to say that it changed my life. The reason I feel it's important just to mention it at least is that for archaeologists and for heritage managers and tribes especially, I think people need to know that this exists, because I'm also, I don't know if another one will be found, but I'm quite certain that this isn't the only one. And so if not something just like this, something equally complex and sacred. And so this was really opened my eyes to how sacred sites can be reflected in the archaeological record in a way that I'd never anticipated. And so the rest of my time, or from that point on, I was really searching for context. And on one hand, I got into this tangent about compiling zooarchaeological data because I thought, well, this is a good way to get context. I don't know if Jake Foss is here, but I want to thank him because when I was scrambling to finish my dissertation, I was like, kind of hopeless at trying to make maps. And he was so kind and made these beautiful maps with GIS. I was just plotting out bear finds and zooarchaeological assemblages on the 3 main biomes. And so this is the Laurentian mixed forest. And I know you can't read all this, but these are percentages of NISP zooarchaeological data. The red are bears. And so here's the bear site, lots of bears. Here's the Christ site, which I'll talk about later. And then you can see little bits of bears showing up elsewhere. The yellow is artiodactyl, so any hoofed mammal, bison, moose, elk, deer, caribou, all combined. The black is fur bearers, like beaver, muskrat, anything that would be involved in the fur trade. Blue is fish, and then this olive green is unidentified. And so this gives you a sense of how underrepresented bears are, but then they really jump out at a few of these sites. Here's some examples. I'll come back and talk about this one later, so I won't mention that now. Right here on the right on the center, these are calcined or cremated grizzly bear claws from the McKinstry site. They were excavated from a mound, but they've been ritually burned. Now with the question of grizzly bears in Minnesota, claws, teeth are very portable. And so that doesn't really answer that question. But here at the Animush site, this is a site that Colleen Wells and Thor Olmundson and Matt Matson excavated near the Mississippi headwaters. Here's a pit feature with broken up bones of the entire forelimbs of a grizzly bear. This is really, they were much bigger than a black bear. Colleen tried to get a DNA sample run to confirm the ID. And unfortunately, the DNA could not be sequenced. However, just from examining the bones with them, I'm certain that these this is a grizzly bear. Portable art, here's a fur trade item, a bear effigy. Here's a little stone bear from the Mississippi headwaters as well, and it has little copper eyes. It's a beautiful little bear, and it's a minimally modified like river pebble. I'm guessing maybe the person who made it, saw the bear in the stone. It's a really neat thing. Up here, 21 SL 1107. This is the site in Vermilion State Park where Dave Radford and his colleagues found all the obsidian. And years ago, or back when they were working on that, there was a small assemblage of calcined bone fragments, and I looked at that material for them to see if there was anything identifiable, and they wanted to get a radiocarbon date, which worked. And there was one piece that was identifiable, and I could not believe it because I was such a excited little bear nerd. But it's the calcined tip of a bear toe. This is a second phalanx from a bear's paw. This is the comparative specimen, but there's the archaeological piece. And so what an exciting site. Here's another biome. This is the deciduous forest. And then this is the aspen parklands up here, which is also deciduous. You can see here's a big, lots of bears at the Christensen Mound site. Here's the Lake Bronson site with a burned bear paw up here. And examples from there. Again, rock art. This is from Wakantipi or Carver's Cave in St. Paul. And here's this bear, and it's got that big shoulder hump. And so which is a trait of a grizzly bear that a black bear does not have. So I can't prove it, but given that the hump was part of what was drawn, or depicted, I think it's reasonable to think that's a grizzly bear. Coney Island to the west in Lake Waconia, here's a black bear metacarpal, and you can see cut marks on it. Here's the Sheffield site on the St. Croix River, a bear scapula that in a comparative specimen, and we speculated with Science Museum staff that maybe this is part of a scapula hoe. It's modified similarly to more commonly found scapula hoes out of bison or elk. And there are none of those bigger animals at this site, but there are little scapula hoes from deer, and then this may be one from bear. A few cases of effigy mounds in southeast Minnesota. And here at HE7, this is the Lincoln Mound site in Bloomington. Here's this piece of a metatarsal, so like the end of it's from the back paw of the bear. This is all different views of one bone, but it was huge. And this comparative specimen from the Bell Museum is a grizzly bear, a brown bear from a zoo. This one is substantially bigger, and so I'm confident that is a grizzly bear as well, from about 2,000 years ago in the Twin Cities. And then the last biome is the prairie parklands, and so not as many sites, and bear not as well represented, but there are some there. And here's an example again. Rock art, Jeffers petroglyphs, pipestone, images of bears. And then in Big Stone County, from a mound that was excavated by adventurous picnickers in the 1910s, there were a few bear skulls. One of them has, on the bottom here, has red ochre on it. And this big one has, you can't see the cut marks, but they're on the lip and on the top of the skull around where the ears would be. But then the bottom of the skull is kind of carefully broken open here, probably to have it on a pole or something like that, probably related to during mound building ceremonies. I do not know, but fascinating. Here's a summary of the different biomes and the finds. And so this kind of supports what, the historical picture is, that where most bears are up in the Northeast, there's this deciduous band of forest is really nice bear habitat. And then there's relatively few in the prairie, but there were once bears across the whole state. Now Now, the three case studies I'm going to talk about are all related to Dakota history, and they're all from the late woodland period, from what Eldon Johnson described as the Wakan phase and the Shakopee phase. So this is like Cathio pottery, Sandy Lake pottery, approximately. Before I get to those, though, I just wanted to mention this one site with cremated or calcined bearpaw up in Voisers National Park. And this is a middle woodland laurel site. And there's all calcined bone, but there's at least two bears are represented. Again, these are the bigger ones are the comparative specimens, but there was an adult bear and a cub. So probably a winter site, because the bear cubs are born during the winter when the mother is dormant. And so most of the calcined assemblage could not be identified, but there's mostly paw fragments are what are identifiable as black bear. And I've enjoyed kind of speculating about these cremated paws, and I've wondered if they could be part of a bear feast or a remnant of a bear feast, because the ceremonies would mostly focus on the skull and the paw. If the paw is being cremated, burned up in the fire afterwards, maybe that's a subtle but identifiable clue. Now the Cray site, this was excavated, this is in Cathio National Historic Landmark, excavated by Guy Gibbon in 1972. And they found a feature with lots of bear bones in it. I identified the animal bones, and lots of black bear, very little of anything else, but a minimum of 32 black bears, which is a lot. Most, in terms of the body parts, most of them are from the mandible. And so there's a few or some cranial bones, which are mostly teeth, but they're almost all these little tiny teeth up front, the incisors, and then there's some like little vestigial premolars, which are like the size of a pencil lead, and then a few postcranial, compared to the number of mandible fragments, not very many postcranial remains. And so the lower right second molar is what we got the minimum number of 32 bears from. And so the taphonomy of this was, I think, really instructive. So this is the modification of the bear, of the bones. There's cut marks. You can see them from disarticulating. So this is like the little part of this mandible. There's cut marks on the inside of this jaw. This would be like on the tongue side of the jaw. And a lot of the bone, you can see it's kind of burned and blackened and scorched. And so along that and Guy's description of fire-cracked rock, which normally wouldn't have been noticed, and there's a little bit in the collection, I think that is, I think it's an earth oven where these bear heads were cooked. And then you pulled out when they were done, pulled them out, and the lower jaws, in some cases at least, were kind of falling apart, and so those stayed in the feature. Interestingly, there's also some calcined bear paws, the cremated bear paws, and so this might be, you could maybe consider this the connection between this bigger, more obvious, spectacular bear feast site with all these little subtle ones where all you have left are the bear paws. Now, earlier on, I got really intrigued by the idea of bear graves. And so from the example I showed you from Sweden, here's an example of the Christensen mound. This was excavated in 1948. The Science Museum was there first. That's Lewis Powell. Then Eldon Johnson excavated part of the mound. The landowner, this guy, was in the process of destroying it, and it is gone. So that is really unfortunate. This is the mound right here. And also in 1907, Newton Winchell was at the site, and somewhere right in here, there was a wagon road down to the lake, and there were bear bones eroding out of there. So and later on studied these as well. I studied the ones for the mound, from the mound prior to NAGPRA consultation, or for NAGPRA consultation. Here's some images of that. Lots of mandibles, lots of loose teeth. You can see sexual dimorphism. Here's these two ulnae. One's a lot bigger than the other. Bears are very sexually dimorphic. Males get a lot bigger than females when they, if they live long enough. And that's I'll come back to that. There's young bears here. These canines are hollow. So those are like, cubs or yearlings. But lots of bears and mostly cranial fragments, not many postcranial, but some. So with all those molars, those cheek teeth, I got really interested in, I'd measured the cheek teeth from the bear site, and I had all these from the Christensen mound. They both assemblages have been reburied, but I was curious about, I thought there must be maybe more data potential, and so I just plotted it out, and you can see that the distributions are different. And so there's these two peaks. Christensen mound in green has a lot bigger range. In orange, the bear site is more toward the one side. I wondered if, does that mean with sexual dimorphism, does the bear site have all or mostly male bears? I don't know. I needed the bear Rosetta Stone, and that the Rosetta Stone, of course, is from Egypt, and that's how it has the 3 inscriptions that are all the same message, but hieroglyphics, Demotic, and Greek, discovered in 1799. And so people could read Demotic and Greek to know that it was the same. And that's how the breakthrough came to translate hieroglyphics. And so this is exactly like that. This is with bear teeth. And so the DNR has this long-term bear research biology project, radio collared bears, things like that. Well, GPS satellite collars now. But over the decades, if a bear died, whenever possible, if they could retrieve the skull, they did. And so they have this collection of skulls of bears of known life history. And so there's 33 females and 21 males in the sample that I was able to record. They're mostly young bears. Bears can live up into their 30s in the wild, but in a heavily hunted area of great bear habitat like much of Minnesota, it's generally going to be a young population. And so anyway, this was a really helpful thing. And so I measured so many teeth over and over and over. There's lots of measurements per skull. I measured the length and the width and then I added those together, and I did comparative statistics and t-tests and all that stuff, because I wanted to see if there were significant differences. And I know you can't read the details of this. I'm just going to tell you what they are. For each one of these is a tooth: upper premolar, fourth premolar, upper first molar, upper second molar. The magenta is the female, the light blue is the male. And so there's the range. And so in every case, this is length and width and then the sum. In every case, the females are smaller than the males, but there's a big overlap. And in every case, the differences are statistically significant. But because of the overlap, if you had one tooth, you wouldn't really be able to tell from the measurements. You could maybe guess if it was on one extreme or the other, but you couldn't be certain. However, for comparing assemblages of teeth, this was a really, really useful thing. So this is the upper teeth. This is the lower teeth, same thing. So lower fourth premolar, first, second, third molar, same pattern for every one of them. And so here's some archaeological examples. And so this is for the lower second molar. And so here's the females, here's the males, and then some archaeological sites. So the Crace site, ML3, the range exceeds all of the, most of the range of the modern bears. This site is about 800 years old, late woodland. And so it's both, I would say both males and females, maybe skewed more toward males. The Christensen mound site spans both, maybe more equal or a few more females. And then here, this 1907 thing from collection from the Christensen mound site that Winchell made, I was really surprised by this. It was appeared to be all males. I did not expect that. I thought it was going to be the same as the Christensen mound, or the ones from the mound, but it was not. And so there, the Crace site, we've only got got lower teeth. The bear site, which is in purple here, we've only got upper teeth, and so we don't have everything on the same thing. But this is the upper second molar. Again, female, male. Here's the Christensen mound, showing both. Here's the 1907 collection from the Christensen mound site from Winchell, again males. And here's the bear site, again males. And so either all or mostly male bears. And so there's different activities going on. And so more of a cross section of the bear population with the Christensen mound and the Crace site, a select group at the bear site, and then at the Christensen mound site outside of the mound. And so and these sites are, the Christensen mound site's about 800 years old. The bear site's about 400 to 500 years old. And so a real time depth to this difference. The other thing that I showed you, and I'm running out of time, I'm going to talk fast. The last thing is tooth wear. I wanted to look at relative age as expressed in teeth. And this index was developed for cave bears, which are much bigger in Europe, but the shape is still the same. And so Mary Steiner developed this, and it breaks it out into juvenile, prime, and old adults with these different categories. Oops. And so for the Crace, for the modern bears from Chippewa National Forest, here's the age profile. So really skewed young, which we knew because we know that their life history. So mostly young bears reflected in the tooth wear. That's a really nice test because it shows, at least in this case, it works. Now, I did not expect this. The Crace site, 800 years old at Mille Lacs, very similar tooth wear profile. And so from this sample anyway, it looks like bears at Mille Lacs, the bear population at Mille Lacs 800 years ago was pretty similar to that of today, meaning that there's lots of them, very good bear habitat, but also heavily hunted, and so skewed young overall. The other sites, the bear site, mostly old, and which is really different. So big, old, probably all male skulls. And this is the collection from Christensen Mound, which has a lot more old skulls, but also young ones. So not exactly the same, but different than the other one from Christensen Mound. So these sites are superficially similar in that there's lots, when you just look at the bones in the curated collections, there's lots of teeth, there's some other bare bones, and then other types of artifacts, but it really gets into the context, reveals differences. So I think that the bear feast is represented at the Crace site, and very likely other sites with cremated bear paws. I think the Christensen Mound site is a bear grave, but in the sense that the burial mound is also a human cemetery expressed through secondary burials. And so the human bones did not have all the body parts represented. They were brought there from somewhere else. The same thing with the bear bones, mostly skulls, but then some other types of postcranial bones. And then some other aspect of bear power is represented at the bear site and the non-mound part of the Christensen Mound site, where there's a ritual by a group that involves, large, predominantly male, if not all male, bear skulls for a different purpose. And so as an interpretive thing, I was very pleased with that result. I want to thank you. And I also, if you want to know more about any of this, the upcoming issue of the Minnesota Archaeologist, I hope I got the volume number right, but it's anyway coming out this year. The issue in honor of Guy Gibbon, there's an article about the Crace site, and one of the disappointments in my stupid, overly long dissertation was that I couldn't give enough time and consideration and space to all these things I'd been thinking about for so long. And so it was really nice with this article to be able to develop the interpretation of the Christ site better. There's also this lovely book that Heather Lapham and Greg Wazelkoff put together. It's an edited volume published by the University of Florida Press, came out in 2000, and I've got an article in there about summarizing some of the Minnesota stuff. There's the other papers in there are amazing, so it's worth your time if you want to check that out. And wanted to say thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if we have a little time left.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David. That was a wonderful presentation. We did have a couple questions that came in. So first question, were there still grizzly bears in Minnesota during the fur trade period?
Great question. I think, well, it seems like yes, but must not have been very many. The only historical reference that I've encountered is from Alexander Henry the Younger, from the Park River Post on the Red River. And he talks about, quite a few black bears, but in one case, a grizzly bear being there. And so there doesn't seem like there were a lot of them anyway. I mean, in general, grizzly bear populations are going to be low. And probably as things were changing in the 19th century, they disappeared pretty quickly, I would guess. But in general, as a really broad statement, I would say that anything that's good bison habitat is going to be good grizzly bear habitat. And so it totally makes sense that they were here before that. I think it was Alexander Henry the Younger that also talked about the Devil's Lake area of North Dakota as having a lot of grizzly bears then, because it was kind of a contested area. And so people weren't living there. And so at that point in time, and so there were lots of grizzly bears there. They generally steer clear of people pretty well.
Excellent, thank you. Next question. Are there any other sites with high quantities of bear remains that you would like to study that you weren't able to include in this particular presentation?
That is a great question. One thing that I did, because I tend to do things backwards, is that during the time that I had available for studying bear sites, I originally had a much broader idea of what my dissertation scope was going to be. And so I was able to go to Sweden with a research grant, and I was able to go to New York to look at some of the collections there. And anyway, so I recorded a lot of data and saw really interesting things. And in the end, this is ridiculous. I have to, scope this down. And so I ended up coming back to focusing on Minnesota and focusing on context, which I think in the end was helpful. But anyway, all these other things I would really like to get back to. I loved meeting with researchers from different parts of the world because the bear sites they had were fascinating. Every time I thought this was so interesting. Every time when I told them about the Minnesota sites, the bear sites and the other ones, it blew their mind. And so it wasn't that we were being, hyperbolic, thinking that these were amazing sites. They are. And one thing about the bear site, it makes me so glad that it is preserved and protected. It's still there. Studying these museum collections from the Christensen Mound site that is tragically gone, and all these other places that I'm glad the excavations happened, because the places are gone now, largely. But that spectacular one is still there, and still fulfilling, as the Dakota elders said, still fulfilling the purpose for which it was made. So that's pretty cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've got another question here. Why do you think there are mostly skulls and paw parts at archaeological sites? Where is the rest of the bear?
That is a very good question. So it might be, it might, I think it was largely that the rituals focused on the skull and the paws, and maybe maybe the idea of this is that those are the most kind of recognizable representative parts. They maybe carry the identity more. It's also something that you see. I'm not a bioanthropologist, but looking at funerary sites, mortuary sites with secondary burial, you get mostly skulls and limbs, not the other parts of the body to the same degree. And so at these sites like the Christensen Mound site that I think is the bear grave, there are some postcrania. At the bear feast site, there are some postcrania. They must not be put in the special place as much, I guess, as the other pieces, or at least not to the same degree. And at Crace, I mean, it wouldn't be so much that, it's just that I think by coincidence there, the excavation encountered the earth oven, where the heads were cooked. And so maybe other parts were cooked in that earth oven too. I was, thinking about, how big that feature must have been. Like, it must have been this massive feast, because, if you have 32 heads, you have to have 32 bears at least, and we don't know how many more. And so, how big was that earth oven? And was it one of many? How many, were hundreds of people there? It's, it must have been a pretty remarkable event. And so anyway, there's different, I guess, for those two sites anyway, different reasons why they're focused on, why the finds are focused on the heads and feet. For the one more thought about that, for the calcined, the cremated bear paws, I think one part of that might be the taphonomy as well, is that in that when you cremate bone, the bigger bones end up getting reduced to unrecognizable little fragments, where the harder, smaller, denser pieces, like the bones of the paw, are more likely to be recognizable. And so it might be that other parts are getting cremated too, but what is archaeologically recognizable is the paw. And there's like ethnographic descriptions of the paw being a delicacy and things like that. So there's a connection there, but it's almost an ironic thing, because calcined assemblages are so skewed, because most everything is gone, but then you have these acidic soils, and then once the bone is cremated into these tiny little busted up fragments, it's mineralized, it's not organic anymore, so then it's preserved, but you've lost so much. But anyway, to be able to recognize bear ceremonialism, which is by its nature underrepresented in the archaeological record, in that situation is just kind of ironic.
Thank you. I've got one more as sort of a comment / question here. Someone recalled asking an archaeologist in Manitoba about archaeological sites that might be potentially associated Medawiwan, and remembering they mentioned concentrations of bear skulls in Minnesota. I'm wondering if there's anything else you'd like to share about ceremonial connections to Ojibwe and Dakota and others.
Well, yeah. I mean, the Medawiwan has. I know almost nothing about it, but other than one thing is that it has connections to bear power. That is an element of it, and so I don't. It's possible that bear feasts and that sort of event could be associated. These three are not. We know that because they're associated, they're in contexts that indicate late woodland Dakota presence, even though they are in areas where the Ojibwe were later. And so there could be other sites that are related to that. There are examples in Minnesota at Mille Lacs and elsewhere of bear ceremonialism represented in Ojibwe components as well. There's like at the Vineland Bay site, there was a bear skull in a pit. Excuse me, and there were historic artifacts associated with that, so it was definitely from the Ojibwe component. Some of the fur trade items are related to, are probably related to Ojibwe communities. I wonder about the little stone bear. If I haven't talked to anyone with traditional knowledge about this yet. And I personally don't have that, so I can't say, but it just makes me wonder, like, what would the purpose of that be? Would it be from a, from a medicine bundle? Would it be, it's clearly a special thing, especially with the copper eyes. And so could that be related to Medewin? I don't know, but I would at some point love to I guess ask the questions whether it was something that we could talk about or not. I don't know.
Thank you. At this point, that's all the questions I have that came in through the chat. A couple of additional comments about thank you for the wonderful presentation, which I would like to echo. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing this excellent presentation with us.
Well, thank you so much. I've had a wonderful time.